I don't want you teaching them anything about any of those things. I don't want you telling them that you're a Zer. I don't want you pretending that you're Foxkin. I don't want any of that. If you're teaching history, I want you to teach what happened in 1943. I want you to teach math.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Bridgehead. Today, I want to talk about a piece of cultural commentary that I think is very significant for a couple of important reasons. Joe Rogan has the most popular podcast in the world. He frequently tops the charts for the best episodes, and one of the reasons that's so significant is because Joe Rogan really is a microcosm of the ordinary American. And I don't mean the ordinary American is a comedian or an MMA commentator. Joe Rogan is not very religious. He's very libertarian. He has a live and let live political outlook. And so when he discusses cultural issues, often he encapsulates where the American public is actually at. And that's one of the reasons the mainstream media has been so hostile towards Joe Rogan. It's because his audience is larger than theirs. But when he speaks with the voice of normal Americans. Now, I'm not advising that people go and watch Joe Rogan's podcast regularly. I dip into his podcast when he's discussing cultural issues that I deal with here on The Bridgehead, but often his podcast is filled with very blasphemous language. That said, he's a really good bellwether for where the culture is at. And one of the reasons I think that that's important is because the things that he has been saying about the spread of LGBT ideology, of drag queen story hour, really encapsulates what the ordinary American is actually thinking. Because in our current ideological environment, many people sense that there's something wrong in our culture. Many people are creeped out by something like drag queen story hour. Many people understand that the LGBT ideologies that have taken over every major institution have gone far, far, far in the wrong direction. But they either don't know how to quite articulate their uneasiness because they've accepted so many other aspects of this ideology, or they frankly don't dare to speak out about it for fear of social reprisal. And so I want to play for you a video of Joe Rogan commenting on Drag Queen Story Hour, because I think that despite his rough language, that this is an opportunity for us to articulate in very normal terms why these things must be absolutely rejected.
I had good teachers growing up. I had quite a few that I remember. I have a science teacher from 7th grade that to this day I think about fondly. He was a brilliant man, and he taught me about wonder. I think about that guy. I've also had a gang of fucking morons who taught me, and I don't want that gang of morons teaching my children about biological sex or gender or homosexuality or heterosexuality or oral sex or anal sex. I don't want nothing.
Yeah, no, thank you.
I don't want you teaching them anything about any of those things. I don't want you telling them that you're a Zer. I don't want you pretending that you're Foxkin. I don't want any of that shit. If you're teaching history, I want you to teach what happened in 1943. I want you to teach math. This is how you count. This is how you divide. This is algebra. This is what you're supposed to be doing. That's what you're hired for. If you're a drag queen and you're not teaching how to be a drag queen, that's it.
Exactly.
You're not supposed to be. If somebody wants to take drag queen courses, all for you.
Yeah.
But I don't think you should be reading stories to little kids. It just seems fucking bizarre. It's one more factor that kid has to deal with.
Totally. Yeah.
For what reason?
For what reason? And so
inclusiveness?
That's
it's bull.
It's bull. Because it's not inclusive of many other perspectives, a traditional perspective, a religious perspective, a general kind of conservative perspective.
Also, how much are you screening these drag queens?
Well, not enough. Yeah.
What is the odds that someone who's a man who likes to dress in drag has other problems? I'm not accusing all of them of having other problems. I'm sure some of them are just lovely people who like to wear women's clothes. Have at it.
Totally.
Have a good time. However, there's a possibility that you might be a kinky freak.
Yeah.
There's a real possibility if you're putting fake eyelashes on and 10-inch heels and you're calling yourself Miss Wanda and you're wearing fishnets and you tuck your dick into your butthole region and tape it down or whatever they do, it's a possibility you might be out of your mind.
And if you're doing a drag show at a bar in the Castro, and that's a kind of subculture where they're all adults, they're all opting in, have a good time, knock yourself out.
Yeah.
Like, totally fine. But it's like bringing that into the public schools with government funding, with other people's kids. That's when I think reasonable people say no.
Yeah, reasonable people should say no, and the people that don't say no think that they're going to be attacked for being bigoted if they do. But there's so many people that are like on the fence and scared and don't know what to do, and their kids are coming home with these wacky ideas, and they're like, what the f*** do I do? What do I do? And then if you try to go to the school board meetings, you get labeled a domestic terrorist.
Yeah.
This is insanity. Like you're just enforcing indoctrination, and you're just making sure that I comply.
Now, this is not the Christian position on Drag Queen Story Hour or radical sex education in schools. This is the libertarian perspective. This is, he doesn't care what people do in private. He was long a supporter of same-sex marriage. He really doesn't care what people get up to. But he also has common sense. He talks like all of the people I worked with on construction sites. This is weird. It's fundamentally a little bit creepy. Why do they want to read to kids? He's asking the questions that average people have, but on a platform so big that he can't be silenced by CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times. But even the way that he talks, this is how normal people respond when they see the sorts of things that are going on today. I do think that the way this has been articulated is an indication that the culture is not where the LGBT movement is. And the reason that's so important to note is that you have many, many politicians, many, many teachers, many, many people in institutions who do not dare to speak out on this issue because their view of the culture is what unfolds on Twitter. Their view of the culture is the LGBT movement essentially has a vice grip on what's going on. But the only reason the LGBT movement has a vice grip on our culture is because we've been cowed into silence, because we've agreed to stop speaking about these things, because we're afraid of the consequences of getting targeted online by LGBT groups or getting labeled with hate speech. So it takes somebody with a platform so big he doesn't care if people try to cancel him to say what normal, ordinary people are actually saying. Perhaps one of my most controversial views is, although the culture is awful, the culture actually isn't as awful as represented online. Because the reality is most people aren't on board with what we see happening. The majority of people aren't on board with Drag Queen Story Hour. Let me give you one really potent example. In working on my next book, I interviewed a long-term gay rights activist named Fred Sargeant, and I wanted to get his perspective on the movement he was a part of in the 60s and 70s. Fred Sargeant is an incredibly famous historical figure on the LGBT left. In fact, he, with his boyfriend at the time, ran the only LGBT bookstore in the Western world in Greenwich Village in New York, and he was one of the first people to throw a brick at the famous Stonewall riots that inaugurated the gay rights movement. I agree with this man on virtually nothing, but when I asked him what he thought about Drag Queen Story Hour, he said, this is fundamentally creepy. Why do men in dresses want to read to kids? And then he said, and I'll always remember this because of the way that he said it and the fact that it was coming from Fred Sargeant, he said, if the drag queens just care about making people happy, why aren't they performing in old age homes? Why aren't they trying to make other people happy? Why are they going into daycare centers, into preschools, into kindergarten classes? And that's not an exaggeration. The LGBT activists here in Canada are so bent on ensuring that there is a drag queen in every school that the Toronto District School Board actually said that it would be a human rights violation to ban drag queens from reading to kids. Now, let me read you the official description from the Drag Queen Story Hour website, because what's so interesting again is that Joe Rogan instinctively understands that the LGBT movement is up to something here. All it takes to find out that he's right is to take a look at what these people are saying themselves. Let me read the description from the Drag Queen Story Hour website here. DSH captures the imagination and play of the gender fluidity of childhood and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models. In spaces like this, kids are able to see people who defy rigid gender restrictions and imagine a world where everyone can be their authentic selves. It started out as drag queens reading stories to children in libraries and grew into a global phenomenon. DSH now offers literary and creative programming for kids and teens of all ages, no kidding, led by drag queens, kings, and other royal beings. Now, there's a bunch of different things that we could note about this. First, they're not actually hiding the fact that the goal of Drag Queen Story Hour is not just to have fun. It's about to mainstream gender fluidity amongst kids. They want to bring this ideological view to children who are too young to understand what they are being taught. Children listen to adults and just believe what adults tell them. And the drag queens want to be the adults telling kids what to believe. If you bring up that Drag Queen Story Hour is wildly inappropriate, that drag is made up of, number one, cross-dressing men, but two, these are over-sexualized costumes that exaggerate sexual features. This is what drag actually is. And the idiots who are comparing drag to clowns are either being deliberately disingenuous or have no idea what a clown is. This is not the same thing. This is not people in happy costumes reading to kids. It is, as their own website says, the mainstreaming of gender fluidity. Now, I want to read to you from a paper written by two professors explaining why Drag Queen Story Hour is so important to their movement. It was written by Harris Kornstein, an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. He moonlights as a drag queen called Little Miss Hot Mess. And he laid this out in a manifesto that he co-authored with a transgender queer theorist, Harper Keenan, who resides at the University of British Columbia. And the paper is titled Drag Pedagogy, the Playful Practice of Queer Imagination in Early Childhood. And the essay actually explains how Drag Queen Story Hour, just as the website itself says, is a tool for training children to see gender and sexuality differently. Quote, "The professional vision of educators is often shaped to reproduce the state's normative vision of its ideal citizenry. In effect, schooling functions as a way to straighten the child into a captive alignment with the current parameters of that vision. To state it plainly, within the historical context of the USA and Western Europe, the institutional management of gender has been used as a way of maintaining racist and capitalist modes of reproduction." What that means is that they are using Drag Queen Story Hour as a way of breaking down traditional understandings of sexuality and gender, of breaking down the way society has functioned for all of recorded human history. One of the things that LGBT activists frequently say is that Drag Queen Story Hour events are family friendly. This is used in press releases. This is what is claimed in the newspapers when they report on these events. And they say family friendly to accuse those of us who think that it's the opposite, that we are actually being paranoiacs, we're being fear-mongers. And so they address this. Kornstein and Kennan, in their paper on drag pedagogy, actually address the issue of family friendly. And so what they write is that these events are a preparatory introduction to alternative modes of kinship. In other words, introducing people to people who could become their new family. They write this, quote, "DQSH is family friendly in the sense of family as an old school queer code to identify and connect with other queers on the street. As an organization, DQSH may be incentivized to recite lines about alignment with curricular standards and social emotional learning in order to be legible within public education. Drag itself does not ultimately take these utilitarian aims too seriously, but is quite good at looking the part when necessary." So here you go. Here's two LGBT activists writing a paper for prominent universities explaining that Drag Queen Story Hour is essentially an
LGBTQ2 plus
Trojan horse to smuggle this ideology into schools, to break down the traditional understanding of the family, and introducing people to alternative modes of kinship. Now, let me explain what that phrase means for just a minute, because it's a very significant phrase. One of the ways trans activists manage to turn children against their families by introducing them to gender ideology online, persuading them that they may actually be a girl or a boy instead of their biological sex. What they say is that those who reject your new identity should be completely cut out of your life, and that instead you can be embraced by your glitter family. That is a phrase very commonly used by transgender influencers, by online LGBT activists. And so what alternative modes of kinship means is, if your mother and your father love you very much, don't want you to take puberty blockers, don't want you to get sex change surgeries, who don't think gender dysphoria should define the rest of your life, if they want you to get therapy that helps you understand what's going on in your brain instead of affirming that you are a different gender, that you should reject that family and find alternative modes of kinship or glitter family. And so that video by Joe Rogan is very important because just through common sense, by looking at what he sees and commenting on how bizarre this moment in our cultural history is, he has actually said in layman's terms what the drag queen activists, the LGBT activists are actually saying in their official papers and on the Drag Queen Story Hour website. And so I need people to understand that those of us who are commenting on things like Drag Queen Story Hour and pointing out that this is actually an attempt at grooming children, at indoctrinating children, we are not just making something up due to an inherent phobia of some sort. We are simply people who are familiar with what LGBT activists have said the purpose of this education is to begin with.